Hey everybody, I'm Alex from the session team, and this is part 1 of Privacy Expert Answers Your Questions. So we're splitting this up up into 2 parts because you guys had a whole bunch of questions that you wanted us to ask, which is totally understandable. So part 1 is going to be the more general privacy questions, and then part 2, there were a lot of questions that were specifically about sessions. So we'll have a session-themed Privacy Expert Answers Your Questions for part 2. But for now, part 1, we've just got our general questions, and let's jump right on into it. So question number 1, why should I care about privacy? Well, privacy is such a fundamental part of, being a human and living together in a community. You need to have those moments where you're in private because privacy gives you comfort and it gives you safety and it lets you express yourself, who you really are and say things that you might not necessarily be comfortable saying out in public. It lets people develop ideas and come together and create progress in times when otherwise you might not necessarily be able to. And surveillance, it's been proven a lot of time, really stifles progress for communities and prevents us from being able to suggest new ideas or come up with new plans or advocate for change, because a lot of the time those little seedlings get squashed out, before they really have a chance to blossom. So to me, that is why privacy is so important. And on a personal level, it really makes a huge difference when you have that feeling of someone watching over your shoulder or peeking in through, your window. It's not a good feeling. And it's something which I think is ever present these days with technology and the way that it is. And it's something that we should really be trying to change and fix. Question number 2. What are the most secure phones and laptops these days, and what can you do to try and harden your device? So these days, there are a lot of people out there who are trying to make more private or more secure devices out of the box. On the laptop side of things, there are things like Librem, and on the phone side of things, there are things like the Pine phone. And these are really cool products, and a lot of people find them really useful because, out of the box, you can expect a certain level of security and privacy that you might not necessarily get if you just get, the latest MacBook or the latest, Google Pixel device kind of thing. But the problem with them is a lot of the time you're going to end up with hardware that might be a little bit older. It might not necessarily be the latest and greatest, and that might, shorten the lifespan of the device a little bit. But what you can do if you don't want to go down these specialized hardware side of things is you can go ahead and just get, a normal device from your regular manufacturers and then try and harden it like you've suggested there. So a really good stepping stone, a really good starting place is to try and install some kind of open source or more private and secure operating systems onto that device. So on a desktop or laptop, that's going to look like have a look into some Linux distros, select one that suits you, and just give it a go. Install that and start using Linux instead of Windows or Mac OS. And that's going to be a really good starting point because both Windows and Mac OS are sending off heaps of telemetry data and not necessarily looking out for your privacy all of the time. Whereas with Linux, you can have a little bit more peace of mind. And on the mobile side of things, I would recommend Graphene OS. Now that is going to be like a de-Googled version of Android, so you're not going to be able to pop it onto your iPhones. But if you have a Google Pixel or something like that, you can pop Graphene OS on there. And like I said, similar with Linux, you can have that extra bit of peace of mind just at the base layer of your device. And beyond that, obviously always look out for open source and encrypted alternatives to the apps that you're using all of the time. So try and make sure wherever possible, you're using software that's going to respect your privacy as opposed to, things like, Gmail or unencrypted notes apps and things of that nature. Question number 3. How do you evaluate an open source privacy-focused project, especially to determine if it is really doing what it's saying, if it's actually privacy focused and doesn't just have a bunch of vulnerabilities? And there are a few things that you can go through here. If you're a developer, if you understand the more technical aspects, you can go and have a look at things like what encryption libraries they're using, or maybe even how they're being implemented. Now that's going to be super time consuming, and realistically, even if you are a developer, you probably don't want to be going and doing this, especially for all of the applications that you're looking into. And so a lot of the time you're going to have to find other trusted people that you believe and see what they're saying about some of the software. So a really common thing that applications, especially bigger ones, will do is get a third-party security audit. This is something that we did with Session, with Quarks Lab, and if there's a third-party audit with a respected cybersecurity consulting firm, then you can trust they've gone through the code and they've looked and checked it off and said, yep, this all looks good, everything's implemented properly, it's doing what it says on the box. And you can trust that a lot of the time because that firm is, risking their reputation if something goes wrong, and you can trust that they're telling the truth. Another thing that you can do is make sure that that software is open source. Open source software, you're going to have a lot more trouble hiding things, and a lot of the times we see with encrypted messaging apps, when it comes out much later that they actually weren't really secure at all, sometimes not even encrypted at all, it's coming from closed source applications where no one was able to go and check on the code and make sure that everything was looking good. So open source is another thing to look out for. And this next tip kind of goes hand in hand with that one, which is check in on the community, check in on the experts in the space who really know what they're talking about, and see what they're saying about this application. See if you can find third-party articles or commentary, or even sometimes people will write Twitter threads about applications that they've looked into and say, hey, this is looking pretty good, or this absolutely is doing something very wrong, and stay away from it at least for now. Another thing that I normally like to do as well is check in on the visibility of the development team itself. How transparent are they? How willing are they to put their name to the product that they're building? How much do they talk about their build process, and how open are they about it? And for me, that's just a bit of a trust building exercise. And obviously you could do that and still behind the scenes be doing something malicious. But to me, I feel like it reduces the risk, and I like to know who's actually making the tech that I'm using. All right, this next question is a bit more of a niche question. Does Google know what you type or the websites that you're visiting on an Android normie phone, even if you're using another browser not connected to a Google ID like Brave or something like that? And the answer is no, not really. So the Google keyboard is not keylogging all of your keystrokes, at least not as far as they claim, and I've not really seen any evidence that they are doing that. Obviously, they have that text prediction, which will give you the sense that, hey, this thing is listening to everything that I'm typing, but all of that stuff should be done on device. It shouldn't be sent back to the Google server, so they don't know every single thing that you type. Now, what they are capturing is, some other usage data. So I think things like if you use voice dictation on the keyboard, they might capture that. They'll also capture data, like some usage data about when you're using the keyboard, how long you're using it for potentially, and also stuff like crash analytics. So if you're comfortable with that kind of data being shared, then go ahead and use the Google keyboard. There's not really a big reason that you shouldn't, unless you just in principle don't want to use Google software because you don't trust it, which I would understand. But at the same time, it's not like this horrible keylogging keyboard that's going to completely expose you all of the time. So feel free to use it. It's totally up to you to decide if that's information that you're comfortable sharing. On desktop, what can your ISP know about the websites that you're visiting? Now, this one really isn't specific to whether you're on desktop or whether you're on mobile. It's more specific to the network that you're connected to. So if you're connected to your home Wi-Fi from your laptop and your mobile phone, your ISP is going to get information from both. It doesn't necessarily matter about whether you're on desktop or not. And what your ISP is going to get is all of the information about which websites you're visiting, how often you're visiting them, and when you're visiting them. And that's pretty much, there's not really a way around that when you're connected to your home network. Now, that's a lot of trust to place in your ISP, and depending on where you live in the world, ISPs might start blocking certain websites or blocking access to certain parts of the internet. And there are ways, if you don't trust your ISP, to get around this. Now, the most common way is to sign up to and use a VPN. So you could use a VPN like Mulvad, for example, which instead of exposing to your ISP all of the websites that you're visiting, they're just going to see that you're connecting to Mulvad servers over and over. Mulvad is going to act as a man in the middle to go and make those connection requests and then serve the information back to you. Now, what this does, it's not necessarily completely enhancing your privacy in a crazy way, but what you're doing is placing your trust in Mullvad instead of placing it in your ISP. So theoretically, Mullvad can then see, okay, which websites you're connecting to, and then making the connections for you, and all of that same metadata that your ISP would otherwise have. But the idea is, well, I would rather Mullvad have that information than my ISP. The other thing is, if you choose a reputable VPN provider that doesn't store logs, on the flip side, ISPs in a lot of parts of the world are required to keep logs for a certain amount of time. In Australia, I think it's for up to 2 years. So if you don't want those kinds of logs being kept, a VPN is a good way around it. The other thing that you could do is use an onion router like Lokinet, which is going to achieve a similar thing, but there's a smaller element of trust involved because the entry node that you connect to, as opposed to it knowing exactly the website that you're visiting or when you're visiting it, they're just going to be the first link in the chain, and it's only the final node that's actually going to know the website. That is, yet another way to try and protect your information about your browsing data. I would generally recommend VPNs are useful in certain circumstances, but be very careful about which VPN provider you decide to use. And onion routers are also really good in certain situations, but of course have some limitations in terms of bandwidth and speed, so you won't want to use it all the time necessarily. And the last question we have for this video, are there any encryption alternatives in case governments decide to try and weaken encryption systems? And the answer is unfortunately no, not really. So encryption is a mechanism that offers us privacy and security that we just cannot get without encryption. And that is why when these legislations come up, when this regulation comes up, we fight so hard against the possibility of weakening encryption, because there is just no other way to achieve the same qualities without encryption. It is so important. We cannot do privacy and security on the internet effectively without it. It is simply not possible. It is completely off the table. Now, throughout the last 30 odd years, there's been a lot of attempts to try and weaken encryption, regulate encryption, or even limit its use. If you're interested, I recommend you go and take a look at something called the crypto wars. But a lot of the time, this falls flat on its face, because how exactly are you supposed to limit encryption? It's just maths, right? And once that's out there, it's really hard to actually tell people what they can and cannot compute. And so, if you have something like PGP, it's really hard to actually enforce that people don't use it. And so while it's possible for specific pieces of software to be limited or their access to them to be limited, encryption itself is really hard to weaken if you're a government. And that is all of the questions that we have for part 1. Thank you everyone who sent questions in. There were some awesome questions, and I'm sure that some of the answers that I gave are going to invite a bunch more questions, so we'll be happy to do more videos just like this one. And if you've got any more questions for us, make sure to leave them down in the comments, and also make sure to keep an eye out for part 2. See you, everybody.